Well, welcome everybody to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything that we talk about is aimed at helping you to lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in anxious times. My name is Bridgette, and as always, I am joined by Irvin Nugent, my wonderful co-host and collaborator. And Irvin, say hello to folks, and how are you?
Well, hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here once again. I am doing well. Just recording this after the Memorial Day holiday. And I don't know about you, Bridget, but where's this year going to? It's like when I think about we're about to go into June, I go, oh my God. It's the old adage my mother used to say, well, once you get older, time passes more quickly. And I think I'm feeling it. But I'm doing really well and looking forward to a wonderful summer. How about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I had a wonderful long holiday weekend, feeling refreshed. Yes, I relate to your sentiment about time passing more quickly with every passing year, it seems like, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I love summer. So I'm already bummed because I'm like, wait, summer isn't even officially here yet, but then it's going to be gone. I'm feeling, shall I say, optimistic about my ability to not mourn summer as much as I normally do, because you're rubbing off on me, your optimism about everything.
There you go. Okay.
All right. So today we have an interesting topic, don't we, Irvin?
Yes, we do. Tell us more. I'm curious.
The Velvet Rut, as you said. To our listeners, maybe this is something you've heard about before and you've tuned in because you kind of feel like you're in a bit of a rut. Or maybe you manage somebody that you think is in a velvet rut. Or for that matter, maybe you look at your entire team or organization and you think, how do I get them out of this rut? But whatever prompted you or motivated you to tune in, we're so glad you're here today. And we are looking forward to this conversation. So let's rock and roll, Irvin.
Sounds good.
Okay, so before we dive in and talk about what the Velvet Rut is and all that good stuff, a shout out to a couple of people. One is my good colleague, Jim Burns over at Resilient Leadership. And you know Jim Burns, Irvin?
I do. Yeah, I know Jim. Yeah.
He's a great guy. And we were doing a training together, actually, on Resilient Leadership when he mentioned the Velvet Rut as it applied to himself and his career. And it really captured my attention. And I thought, wow, I've been helping clients all these years get out of velvet ruts, but I just didn't, know the term for it. So that got me really curious and digging into it a little bit more. And then last week, I had the privilege of being in Asheville with a client organization where I did a one-day training and presentation on discovering your hidden potential. And I talked about the velvet rut as one of the things that can get in the way of that. And it really landed with this group of leaders. And one of them came up to me at a break and said, oh my gosh, what you said about the velvet rut really got me thinking. And he made a request. He said, would you and Irvin do a podcast on this topic? And I said, absolutely. And so Matt, shout out to you. Thanks for the inspiration to tackle this topic. And so Irvin, my first question to you is, when you hear the phrase, the velvet rut, do certain images or, thoughts come to mind for you?
So I've got to be honest. The first place I went to is back to my mother. And this word velvet has I have images about velvet, and specifically an aunt who had a velvet seat. And my mother was always curious about this. And she thought that this was like super luxurious and was kind of like over the top. I remember because it was red. And my mother always was just fascinated about this chair, this velvet. Why would you choose velvet? And so from that, growing up, I've always considered, velvet being this over the top, this luxurious, comfortable fabric. And so when I think about, velvet rut, I have to say I wasn't too familiar with the term, but it's this. Yeah, I kind of have this image of being in that velvet seat and not wanting to go anywhere. I've kind of been really comfortable in it.
Oh my gosh, it's so funny that you say that. Great minds think alike, because what it conjures up for me is a big, deep, comfortable chair, like in a family room or a den, where the cushions are just plush And when you sit in it, you sink way down into it, right?
Yep.
And your first thought is, oh my gosh, this feels so good. But then you kind of find out that it's kind of hard to get out, push yourself out.
Especially as you get older.
Yes, indeed. And so you maybe only intended to sit in it for maybe a half an hour. You end up all
Yeah.
day because, right, it's just
Yeah.
dark comfortable. So that's
Sure.
interesting. Well, I got curious about where did this term originate? Is there somebody who we can attribute it to? So I did a little looking around, and apparently the person who first coined the term is a guy named David Cohen, who's an author and a journalist. And he wrote about it in a book called The Chosen One. And this is how he defined it in that book. What he said is a velvet rut is a state of being where one is trapped in a comfortable, predictable, and unchallenging existence. And what I have observed as I've coached my clients is that none of us, I don't think any of us, choose to be in a velvet rut. I think it's something that sneaks up on us. I think it unfolds over time without, at first, our conscious awareness. And I would describe it as a situation in which we have gotten a bit too comfortable and a bit too complacent, even with our routines, with our results. And from the outside in, you might not see anything. In fact, things might look really good. We might be enjoying a lot of success financially or otherwise. But what is often quietly brewing on the inside is a sense of dissatisfaction, a sense perhaps of restlessness, because we're not really being challenged in any meaningful way. We're too comfortable. And we know that when we are being challenged in a significant way that leads to growth, there's periods of discomfort with that. It's a cozy place, but it's a place where at some point we become restless. Now, of course, the challenge, as we'll discuss more, is that it's very difficult to get out of it, precisely because of the fact that it feels so cozy to be in the velvet rut. More on that in just a minute. But I'm just curious, Irvin, what does this provoke for you personally? And as you look back on your long and illustrious career, have you ever been in a velvet rut yourself?
Yeah, this actually describes almost perfectly, I think, my latter experience when I was a priest, a Catholic priest. And I think my listeners know I've mentioned that before. But I was in a position which was very comfortable in the sense of I knew what I was doing. I got over the initial nervousness and all that. So I was in a routine. It was something that was easy, meaningful, enjoyable. I could have really been on auto control for a long time. And yet there was brewing within a discontent of there has to be something more for me. There was and kind of really, quietening the noises was like, no, you're in a perfect, you're fine, you're comfortable. I mean, why disturb the peace, And that discontent, I think, grew more. And as I entertained it, came this realization of, do I want to exist in, this living or move on? And I think, part of what I thought of is like, what if I turn 60 and I'm still doing the same thing? And then I look back and I say, God, you could have done something else. And I think for me, that was the beginning of the impetus. So yes, for me, that was very much a velvet rut that I was in.
Fascinating. It sounds to me like the question that you asked yourself or that you reflected upon was, if I'm still doing this at 60, will I have any regrets?
Yeah, very much so.
And the answer was yes.
The answer was yes. And ultimately then that became, I think, the energy to kind of do something about it. Yeah.
That's a good word, because I think it does require a lot of energy to hoist ourselves out of it.
How about you, Bridgette? Any time you felt you've been in a velvet rut?
Yes. I'm going to go back to a time that I recall. I was around 39, turning 40. I had been on a path, a very successful one at work where I was doing a lot of management consulting, working with teams, doing a lot of retreats, sometimes helping with strategic planning. Inevitably, in those things, as you well know, Irvin,
Mhm.
lots of flip charts get created,
Oh,
a lot of things get written.
yeah.
And I was doing one of these, and it was towards the end. I looked around, the wall was, papered with all these flip chart comments that the group had said. And I had this moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I bet if I come back here 6 months or a year from now, none of this will be any different. They'll be in this conversation and they might not have transformed themselves the way they want. And
Mhm.
that just really struck me. And
Mhm.
that made me realize that what I had been doing, while enjoyable and profitable, and in some cases valuable, there was something missing. I couldn't put my finger on it. I was like, there's something missing here. And then lo and behold, I got introduced to coaching.
Mhm.
And what I realized is that the piece that was missing for me in terms of energy, like you spoke of, was being able to work one to one and help a leader transform, which would then help the leader transform the organization.
Yeah.
And now I get to do both. I get to work with groups and I get to work with the leaders in those groups. And it's really working on both fronts that has brought me so much joy and fulfillment. But until I got fortunately introduced to coaching and it got literally shoved in my face by a colleague, I was in that velvet rut. Yeah,
Mhm.
interesting. Wow, it's so revealing to hear about people's velvet ruts, isn't it? Like I
Yeah.
didn't know that you were going to share that story. That's interesting to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So, of course, individuals fall into velvet ruts, and some of our listeners might be now thinking, oh, yeah, I've been in one. I am in one. I know somebody in one. But what I think is also interesting is that companies can fall into
Yeah.
velvet ruts. And man, when that happens, huge consequences, right? So,
Yeah.
Irvin, what do you think? Can you share an example of a company that you think was in a velvet rut?
Yeah. One comes to mind, because I think just as on a personal level, on a organizational level, organizations can become very comfortable, complacent with their success. These can be very successful companies, and yet they don't challenge themselves. They kind of rest on their laurels. And because of that, I think they rest on their way of thinking without challenging themselves. And of course, so there's one thing we know: the market always is changing. The world is changing, and there's new opportunities. There's risks that come up. And so therefore, one example I'm thinking of is IBM. Here we have a very successful company. And if you think back in the good old days, they were selling mainframe computers to businesses and they made a lot of money doing so. And then when this personal computer came on the scene, I am old enough to remember that whole change. you know, Initially successful, I think they failed to see the long-term potential about the operating system that was used to run it. And of course, in pops Microsoft. And so they said, no, we're doing a great job with centralized computing. That's what we do well. Let's stay there. And eventually the rest of the world went a decentralized way of computing. And that's what we have now. And so while successful and comfortable, they lost out on a major opportunity. And so when you think about it today, Microsoft's worth around $3.2 trillion and IBM is worth 160 billion. Now, nothing to shriek about, but really when you think about that, Microsoft now 20 times the size of IBM. And I'm wondering, if we could say IBM was stuck in a velvet rut and what would have happened if they had challenged themselves more? Would they be a bigger player than Microsoft and Microsoft be the smaller one? So there's an example I can think of a company. Anyone you can think of as well on a company level, Bridgette?
Yeah, well, first of all, listening to you say that, boy, it is interesting what the impact is when an entire company is in a velvet rut. I mean, you talked about a difference in millions
Mm,
of dollars,
yeah,
right? Market
yeah.
reach, but then also just the individual employees there. I have another example to share, and this one comes from my husband because he's a big tech guy. He's always talking to me about tech. And I mentioned to him, we were having this conversation. And I said, well, what pops into your head right away? And he said, Intel. And he told me a little bit about their story, which is that they were the largest chip maker in the world at one point, and they supplied the chips for virtually every PC and laptop, including Apple Macintosh computers. So, like your example with IBM, they were making a lot of money. They were doing really, really well. And you pointed out that sometimes what happens is we don't challenge our thinking when we're enjoying so much success, right? So I think this happened to them as well. They didn't see something happening, something emerging in the marketplace, which was the rise of the mobile phone. They didn't think it was going to be as big as it ended up being. And quite frankly, I think they were content to be the world's largest supplier of PC chips. So when Apple approached them about making a chip for the iPhone, they declined because they just didn't think it was going to be the big deal that we all know it ended up being. And so Apple went to TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor. And today, Intel is worth $130 billion and TSMC is worth $830 billion. And Apple is worth $2.9 trillion. Oh my goodness. So I think, like the example that you said, if Intel had not been stuck in a content way of doing business, if they had not been complacent about their success, who knows? Perhaps it would be a whole different ball game today, and they'd be a much bigger player in the market. Absolutely. I mean, they're still around, right? But we don't hear about Intel like we hear about Apple.
Yeah,
for sure. So it's interesting. And who then made those decisions at those companies, right? Well, I don't know. Do you know who made the decision at IBM? No.
Nope.
We know it was a leader. And because at the end of the day, decisions of this magnitude do not get made by consensus. A leader or two has to make the call. And so it brings us back to the individual, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, companies are made up out of individuals, right? And so when leaders in positions of authority who make important decisions themselves stop challenging the way they think and the way that they do business and become content, it often spells disaster for the whole organization. So interesting. All right. So now let's bring it back home to ourselves and to our listeners. And I'm wondering, Irvin, when you think about the clients that you've worked with over the years, can you share an example with our listeners of a client that you worked with who wasn't a velvet rut, a leader, and maybe you helped them get out of it, or maybe something helped them to propel themselves out of it? Any examples?
Yeah, I got a really interesting one. I had a client who was CEO of a large child welfare agency. And you can think just from that that's a pretty stressful job, and it was. And yet he did this with aplomb. I mean, he did this so well and made it look easy. And from the outside, people looked at him really with admiration. He was so well thought of. And he just had this wonderful presence that made it easy. And yet in the coaching, I had known him before the coaching. And this was my perception too. And within the coaching, what came out was just a growing discontent and a fear of, this is what I do. This is, so it was even bigger than it was almost an identity, this is what I'm knowing for. And it's like, whoa, like if I leave this, And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I don't know. This is it. So this was this interesting case of I don't know what, but I think I need a challenge. And I don't know what that is. And what was really interesting, we reached the end of the coaching and the challenge was not identified, but I think there was clarity around that. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading in the newspaper a few years later that shocked to people that they gave up that position and they took over a position in animal welfare in a shelter. And it was a much smaller role.
Interesting.
And it was so interesting. And I remember having a conversation with them a few months later, and they were saying, this is it. This is the challenge I need. This is something which I really think aligns more with my values and I'm walking into a situation where I'm not going to have the support. I'm not going to have everything that I've known for the last 22 years, but I think this is the right move for me. And I just thought, wow, that what a wonderful example of someone who was willing to take the risk and to move out of their comfort zone.
Mm. And, it began with you being able to create the space for them to talk about that restless discontent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Boy,
How about yourself? Any examples come to mind, Bridgette, of a client?
Actually, a lot that fall into a similar pattern of what you just described. I'm thinking of, though, a few clients that I've had the privilege of working with over a period of many years off and on.
Mm.
And these are leaders running businesses and organizations and very deeply committed to those businesses and organizations. But invariably, if you run a business for 10, 15, 20 years, there are twists and turns in your own level of engagement, your own level of interest. And I think one of the toughest velvet ruts is when you're very successful and you're very bored.
Mm.
So you're getting paid a lot of money to be bored.
Yep.
And that's hard. And fortunately, when I think about a couple of these clients, to get out of the velvet rut, they didn't have to leave their company. They didn't have to leave their business, but they did have to reinvent themselves. They did have to figure out a different way to go about their role and a different way to engage with their teams and with their organization. So while it wasn't as risky as the example you gave of them actually leaving, it still required some courage, to admit, I'm not engaged here. And if I'm not engaged here, who else isn't engaged? Yeah. So it's tough, isn't it, Irvin? Because what we're describing are successful people who are admired.
Absolutely.
And so who wants to change that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I guess we have to get down to brass tacks now and talk about, well, what do we do if we find ourselves in a velvet rut? Now, of course, what can happen is life can throw us a curveball. And then we have to pivot and change. Like we've talked about previously on another episode about how the pandemic did that, right?
Yep.
What if the curveball isn't coming and you're in that velvet rut and you do want to get out? Irvin, share with our listeners some things you think are helpful to begin the process of excavating ourselves from that very comfortable velvet chair.
So, interesting question. I think three things come to mind. I think the first thing is, and we've mentioned, is the acknowledgement that it's there, which so often, what struck me as you were speaking is I think sometimes we can almost get into a feeling of guilt that I shouldn't be feeling this way, that I have everything. I'm successful. Things are going, like, what's wrong with me, And it's almost like, the denial of the feeling. So it's just to acknowledge the fact that, yeah, I am feeling this. I am successful and I am discontent. And I think really to be able to do that with empathy for yourself, so not to beat yourself up, and then also with optimism, like what's knocking at the door here? And what's this all about? And this willingness to be curious and to explore it. So I think that's the first step, just to acknowledge that it's there and it's okay that it's there. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't take anything to own something. And then the second thing is to own it, actually, which is, what's happening here? What's my part in it? So you may not feel you're in a rut, but maybe your team is. So maybe, you're part of a bigger team or organization that's in a rut. What's my part in this? How do we get here? And what might I have contributed to it? What are we unhappy with? Because I think, if we don't acknowledge it and own it, we can change what we don't see. So I think those two steps are absolutely essential. And then the third one is what I call paint a picture. Change is painful. So part of what makes this difficult is when we're in a rut, when we're sitting in that nice seat, then we imagine the movement away from that is painful. Why would I? But then there comes a point where I think the pain of the current situation is worse than the pain of change. And ultimately, that's the balance. That's what happens in most people. And so therefore, can we paint a vivid picture of the current state? What is it? Externally, maybe there's some success, but there's brewing in the inside, which is ultimately killing us. I had one client who said that. I said, I just feel dead on the inside. So what is these undesirable conditions? And then paint what's the opportunities? What are the experience that we're opening up to? What are we moving towards? What will this challenge bring us? And I think to paint that picture is really important.
Oh man, those are really great suggestions. And what it makes me think about is that if you're a leader of a team that you think is in a velvet rut, and I've coached many leaders who come to me complaining about the complacency of their teams. And of course, we know that as leaders, we have a profound impact on our teams. Mm. And if we don't ask the question, what's my part in this?
Yeah.
Then we kind of look like, oh, we got to fix that team. But in essence, there is a symbiotic relationship going on there, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a great question to start with. If you're really saying, well, it's not me that's in the velvet rut, it's them. Okay. And what's your part in that? Then the idea of painting the picture, I think, for the team becomes vital, because if the team is really comfortable, they just may not see the implications.
Yeah.
Right. Of their complacency. They may not see something on the other side of this that's any better than that really nice, comfortable velvet chair they're sitting in. And you as the leader, it's your job to paint that vivid picture of what is possible on the other side and why it's worth it to take a risk, to face into some new initiative that, nobody said you had to do. You just decided you were going to do it. In fact, that's the other thing I would add is that I think we have to require more of ourselves and our teams if we feel like they're in a velvet rut, and we have to come up with a specific, bold challenge or a project or an initiative that by its very design requires people to think differently, to feel uncomfortable for a while, to become learners again, right?
Yep.
That's where all the growth is. It's in that messy process of learning something new. Yeah. So I love those strategies.
Yeah. It takes a little bit of courage. Do you agree to kind of move there?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just going to say. We do have to gather our courage, because when we decide to take a risk or to move in a new direction or to put ourselves into the mode of a beginner, it's going to be messy, and we know that we're not going to be perfect at it. And there's always the risk of failure when we try something new. I think we have to just acknowledge that courage is needed to get out of a velvet rut, because there is no guarantee and there is no certainty except this. If you don't keep changing and growing, then you will face consequences, perhaps not of your own choosing. And you may have regrets, like you mentioned in your own personal story, right?
Yeah. And I love that word, courage comes from the Latin core, the heart. And I love that because so often this is a movement of the heart. This is something in spite of everything we have, the heart is discontent. And it's from that. I just love that kind of that courage to kind of be bold.
And to speak from the heart when we are trying to inspire others to move out of their comfort zones, right?
Yeah.
So what an interesting conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I've learned something about you too, Irvin, but I know we're not complete yet with sharing a core practice for our listeners. And so what do you have in mind?
So I'm intrigued by, you've mentioned it a few times, and we've talked about this word complacency. And I think, part of the exercise of acknowledging and owning is this kind of being comfortable in the complacency. So maybe the practice we could talk about today is pockets, kind of this discovery of pockets of complacency. What pockets of complacency might be in our life? And I think we've talked today about, we as human beings love the predictable, the comfortable. The problem with that is we may become a little complacent. And from the outside, things may look just fine and dandy. We're enjoying that success. And yet, I think at times we might not at first realize we're in a velvet rut. And do we have the courage? Do we have the time to stop and maybe what's going on in our lives, what might be something that is impacting our growth, our enthusiasm, our engagement. So maybe what we could do is build some time in to step back from the to-do, the predictable in our lives, which often take over, and look for pockets of complacency. Where are those places where we're so comfortable, so predictable, and maybe just a little stale? And can we look around with curiosity to facets of our work and bigger life and maybe see, I might just be in a little bit of a velvet rut there. And this may be with a particular relationship. It may be in work relationships or career in general. And what routines have become just a little stale. And, I think we'll notice that because they drain us. They don't give us enthusiasm and energy. Maybe what projects are we working on that we're just not showing up with the same energy or the sense of engagement that we did? And just notice that without judgment, just notice it. And then ask, what's one step I might be able to do to inject some energy into this facet of work or life and maybe inject a greater sense of challenge, growth, or engagement?
That is a terrific practice. And I like the idea of pockets of complacency.
Yep.
Because, we're not always just in a velvet rut about our entire life or our entire job.
Yeah, I agree.
As I was listening to you, I was reminded of something that when you asked the question, when have you been in a velvet rut? There was another time recently, and that is on the other side of the pandemic. So you and I have discussed that during the pandemic, we both had to learn and grow in new ways because we had to deliver our training virtually. We had to really pivot in the way that we went about getting business. And it was a scary time, but you know what? I found it, and I feel so privileged to say this, I found it to be a highly engaging time because people came to ask me to do a lot of keynotes on resilience. I just was learning and growing every single day. And then on the other side of that pandemic, things settled down, which is good. But then I got comfortable again. And I started to notice a pocket of complacency where I didn't have the same enthusiasm. And I thought, I need to come up with a new challenge for myself. And that's when I decided to ask you if you would be willing to do this podcast with me. It was born out of an inner restlessness and a desire to grow in new ways. And that wouldn't have come up to my attention if I hadn't been doing the practice you suggested, which is just with curiosity, kind of noticing where are those little pockets and places where I'm not showing up with the same enthusiasm, and what do I want to do about it? Yeah. So great things are on the other side of our velvet ruts.
I love that.
Well, Irvin, thank you as always for this conversation. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. This was just a real joy as always, and I look forward to our next conversation. And teeing that up, what is it going to be about, Irvin?
Yeah, we have reached, in conversation, we have decided that we're now, this is episode 62, and we think it's maybe time to revisit some of the fundamentals of this approach of resilience that we have taken and how, kind of give it a little summary, spend one or two episodes and just revisit some of these key thoughts again, because I think it's we've got a lot of new listeners as well. And all our episodes are based in this systems thinking. And what does that mean? And what does it mean for how I show up as a leader? So next episode, we're going to have a first part of that and revisit on 3 ways that a leader needs to think about showing up specifically in these turbulent times.
Sounds wonderful. I look forward to it. Thank you, Irvin.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye now.